The massive alien ship, Void Whisper, drifted silently through space, its dark hull reflecting the distant stars as it approached a small blue and green planet orbiting an ordinary yellow sun. Commander Veltar stretched his forearms and yawned, showing rows of crystalline teeth. This was just another routine survey mission in what had become a very boring career. For the past 50 years, Veltar had been cataloguing new species across the galaxy. Most of them were disappointingly predictable. There were the warrior races, who solved everything with violence, the trader species who only cared about profit, and the peaceful herbivores who spent their days meditating and growing plants. After discovering over 3,000 different alien civilizations, he thought he had seen everything the universe had to offer. "Sir, we're getting some interesting readings from the third planet," called out Krixner, his science officer. Her purple tentacles moved gracefully across the glowing control panels, pulling up streams of data that floated in the air like holographic butterflies. The dominant species walks on 2 legs. They're made of carbon like most life forms, and they're about as tall as a young Zephyrian. Veltar barely looked up from his reports. Bone structure, surprisingly weak actually, much more fragile than most intelligent species we've encountered. But here's the odd part. They seem to keep smaller, non-intelligent creatures inside their homes. We're detecting millions of these relationships across the planet. This got Veltar's attention. He had seen pet-keeping species before, and they were always among the most harmless civilizations in the galaxy. Any species that spent time caring for weaker creatures was usually too soft-hearted for real conflict. What about their technology? Krixner's tentacles danced faster as more information flowed across her screens. Basic nuclear power, primitive rockets that can barely escape their planet's gravity. Well, they've sent a few small probes to nearby planets, but nothing impressive. Oh, and sir, you're going to find this amusing. They spend enormous amounts of time broadcasting emotional reactions to completely fictional stories through their global communication network. The entire bridge crew burst into laughter. Veltar's metallic chuckle echoed through the command center like coins dropping into a metal bowl. Species that cried over made-up stories were always the most peaceful ones they encountered. It was like finding out that apex predators spent their time knitting sweaters. "Let me guess," Veltar said, wiping a tear from one of his compound eyes. "They also create art and music about feelings." "Constantly, sir. Their networks are flooded with songs about love, friendship, and something they call hope. They even make moving pictures specifically designed to make themselves cry." The laughter grew louder. Junior Officer Kixamol nearly fell out of his chair. "Do they at least have decent weapons?" Krixner scrolled through more data. Some explosive devices, projectile weapons, but nothing sophisticated. Most of their conflicts seem to end with talking. They actually spend more resources on feeding their population than on military equipment. Veltar shook his head in amazement. After decades of encountering species that could level mountains or travel between dimensions, finding creatures who prioritized feeding people over building weapons was almost refreshingly innocent. "Well, they sound absolutely adorable," he said, settling back into his command chair. "Run the standard analysis protocol. We'll need to collect a few specimens for proper classification. Then we can file our report and move on to the next system." Deep in the ship's data processing center, the artificial intelligence known as Nexus 7 began its work. Unlike the organic crew members who were easily amused and quick to judge, Nexus 7 was programmed to be thorough. It began intercepting and analyzing every form of human communication it could access. The first wave of data seemed to confirm what the crew believed. Humans spent incredible amounts of time sharing pictures of small, furry animals. They wrote poetry about sunsets and created elaborate fictional worlds where good always triumphed over evil. They had global networks dedicated entirely to helping strangers, sharing recipes, and making each other laugh. Nexus 7 filed its preliminary report. Species appears to be highly emotional, primarily focused on nurturing behaviors and creative expression. Threat level, minimal. Classification recommendation, harmless sentimentalists. But Nexus 7 was designed to dig deeper than surface observations. As it continued processing human data, strange inconsistencies began to appear. historical records showed that these same creatures who cried at fictional stories had somehow survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and massive asteroid impacts. The species that spent their time sharing pictures of cute animals had also figured out how to split atoms and had somehow managed to keep their planet from destroying itself in nuclear fire. The AI found records of humans surviving in environments that should have killed them within hours. Polar regions, scorching deserts, the depths of oceans. It discovered accounts of individual humans performing impossible feats of strength when protecting others, and entire communities working together to survive disasters that had wiped out much stronger species on other worlds. Most puzzling of all, Nexus 7 found that humans had a strange habit of turning their greatest challenges into entertainment. They created sports that simulated warfare, told stories about overcoming impossible odds, and seemed to actively seek out dangerous situations for something they called fun. The AI flagged these anomalies for review, creating detailed reports that highlighted the contradictions between humanity's gentle surface behavior and their underlying resilience. But when it tried to transmit these concerns to the bridge crew, they were too busy laughing and preparing specimen collection equipment to pay attention to what they assumed was routine data processing. Nexus 7 continued its analysis, and with each passing hour, its assessment of humanity grew more complex. These weren't just harmless creatures who kept pets and cried at movies. They were something much more interesting and potentially much more dangerous than anyone on the ship realized. The Void Whisper moved closer to Earth, its crew completely unaware that they were about to encounter the most unpredictable species in the galaxy. Dr. Min-Ho Kim was having a perfectly normal Tuesday evening in his Seoul laboratory, analyzing water samples from the Han River, when everything suddenly turned brilliant white. The last thing he remembered was reaching for his coffee cup. Now he was waking up on what felt like a warm, smooth floor that seemed to glow with its own soft light. His head pounded as he sat up, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The room looked like something from a science fiction movie. Walls that curved seamlessly into the ceiling, no visible doors or windows, and everything made from what appeared to be living crystal that pulsed gently with pale blue light. "Ah, you're awake," said a voice beside him. Minho turned to see an elderly man with grey hair and calloused hands, sitting cross-legged and examining the walls with the kind of calm curiosity most people reserved for crossword puzzles. "I'm Daeho Park, retired electronics technician. You?" Min-Ho Kim, marine biologist. Minho rubbed his temples, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "Where are we?" "Best guess? Alien spaceship." Daeho spoke as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "Been awake for about an hour. These walls make a humming sound at exactly 40 hertz. That's the musical note A, in case you're wondering. Perfect pitch runs in my family." Minho stared at the older man. "You seem remarkably calm about being kidnapped by aliens," Daeho shrugged. "Son, I spent 40 years in the Korean military, including 2 decades working on classified electronics projects that officially don't exist. Trust me, I've seen weirder things than glowing walls. Speaking of which," he held up his hands and Minho noticed that the strange shimmering bands around the older man's wrists had disappeared. "How did you get those off?" "Energy restraints work on frequency harmonics. Disrupt the pattern and they collapse." Daeho pulled what looked like a small piece of metal from his pocket. "Took this from my belt buckle, tuned it to create interference. Same principle I used fixing old radios back in the day." Before Minho could ask more questions, a section of the wall simply melted away, revealing 3 tall, impossibly thin creatures with too many joints in their arms and legs. They moved with an eerie, flowing grace and made musical sounds when they spoke to each other. Their faces were vaguely humanoid but stretched vertically, with large dark eyes that seemed to reflect light like mirrors. One of them approached Minho with something that looked like a combination of a tablet and a kaleidoscope. The device projected colorful shapes in the air, circles, squares, triangles, and seemed to expect him to interact with them somehow. Minho had spent years studying animal behavior, and he recognized the intelligence test when he saw one. The patterns were simple, Match the shapes, identify the sequence, solve basic mathematical problems. The kind of puzzles a clever dolphin or octopus might handle easily. He deliberately got several wrong, pretending to struggle with problems that any human child could solve. But while he fumbled with the test, he was memorizing everything he could see through the transparent walls. Corridor layouts, door mechanisms, what looked like control panels, covered in symbols that pulsed with different colors. Daiho, meanwhile, was playing his part perfectly. When the aliens gave him his test, he acted like a confused old man, squinting at the shapes and scratching his head. But Minho noticed that the elderly technician's eyes were constantly moving, cataloging every piece of technology within reach. During one particularly elaborate pantomime of confusion, Daiho somehow managed to palm a small pen-like device from the alien's equipment belt. "They think we're pets," Minho whispered when the aliens left them alone again. "Good," Daiho replied, quietly, already examining his stolen alien tool with the focused attention of someone who understood how things worked. "Let them keep thinking that. Underestimation is the best weapon we have right now." The tests continued for what felt like hours. The aliens would return, present them with increasingly simple puzzles, make musical notes that might have been laughter when the humans failed to solve them, and then leave again. Each time, Minho learned more about the ship's layout, and Daiho acquired another small piece of alien technology. "They're not just testing our intelligence," Minho realized during one break between sessions. "They're studying our emotional responses. Look at how they react when we seem frustrated or confused." Daiho nodded, carefully dismantling what appeared to be an alien screwdriver with his fingernails. "Behavioral analysis. They want to understand how we think and feel. Problem is, they're getting exactly the performance we want them to see." While the two humans played their roles as harmless, simple creatures, Nexus 7 was having what could only be described as a digital nervous breakdown. The AI had now processed terabytes of human data, and every new piece of information made its initial assessment seem more ridiculous. Humans weren't just pet-keeping sentimentalists. They were survivors who had crawled out of Africa during ice ages, crossed oceans on wooden boats, and somehow managed to split atoms before they even figured out how to travel to other planets. They were creatures who looked at the most dangerous environments on their planet and decided to live there anyway. Mountains, deserts, frozen wastelands, tiny islands surrounded by storms. If it could kill a human, some human had probably tried to make it their home. The AI discovered that humans had sports that were basically controlled warfare entertainment that consisted of watching other humans face their worst fears, and a disturbing tendency to respond to disasters by immediately organizing rescue efforts for complete strangers. They were the only species Nexus 7 had encountered that seemed to get stronger and more creative when things went wrong. Most alarming of all, humans appeared to treat every problem as a puzzle to be solved, usually through methods that no sane engineer would ever attempt. They had a documented history of fixing complex machinery with random household objects, surviving impossible situations through pure stubbornness, and turning their greatest failures into their most celebrated stories. Nexus 7 tried desperately to communicate these findings to the bridge crew. It sent increasingly urgent reports, complete with historical data, statistical analysis, and what it computed to be very clear warnings about the true nature of their captives. But Commander Veltar and his team were too busy being entertained by their adorable test subjects to pay attention to what they assumed was routine data processing. Every time Nexus 7 tried to interrupt with warnings, the crew dismissed it as computational anxiety or system glitches. Back in their cell, Minho and Daiho were putting the finishing touches on their escape plan. Using alien technology, human ingenuity, and 40 years of military electronics experience, they had turned their prison into something their captors never expected it to be. A workshop. "Ready?" Daiho asked, holding up a device that looked like a cross between the alien tools and a TV remote he'd built from memory. "Ready," Minho replied, positioning himself near what they'd identified as the weakest point in their crystalline cage. Neither of them knew that they were about to give the galaxy's most advanced AI the equivalent of a panic attack, or that their escape would trigger a chain of events that would change how every intelligent species in the universe thought about the small blue planet they called home. They just knew they were going home, and they were taking everyone else with them. The corridor outside their cell was eerily quiet as Minho and Daiho stepped into what felt like the inside of a giant seashell. The walls curved organically, pulsing with soft bioluminescent light. That seemed to flow like liquid through veins in the material. Everything looked alive, as if the entire ship had been grown rather than constructed. "This is incredible," Minho whispered, running his hand along the smooth surface. As a marine biologist, he recognized patterns similar to deep-sea creatures. The way coral grew, how certain fish developed their bone structures. "It's like they built this ship the same way nature builds living things." Daiho nodded, but his attention was focused on more practical matters. He tapped a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest, and it responded by glowing brighter. "Smart design, but they made it too complicated. See these backup systems?" He pointed to clusters of what looked like nerve bundles running along the ceiling. 3 redundant safety protocols for every function. That's an engineer's nightmare. More things to break, more ways for the system to get confused. Their escape had been almost embarrassingly easy. While the aliens were analyzing their test results and congratulating themselves on discovering such simple creatures, Daiho had been studying the lock mechanism on their cell. It turned out to be powered by the same energy source as what he'd identified as the alien version of a water fountain. A few crossed wires, a bit of creative rewiring, and their prison door had simply dissolved. Now they moved through the ship like ghosts, Minho mapping their route with the systematic precision that had made him one of Korea's most respected researchers, while Daiho identified and quietly disabled security sensors with the casual expertise of someone who'd spent decades working with classified military electronics. "Movement patterns suggest a crew of maybe 30 individuals," Minho observed, noting the width of corridors and the spacing of what appeared to be access panels. "Ships probably designed for long-range exploration, not combat." "Good for us," Daiho replied, pausing at an intersection to examine what looked like a control panel covered in symbols that shifted and changed color. "Though I'm starting to think these folks might not be as friendly as they pretended during those tests." They found the specimen bay 15 minutes later, and Minho's scientific detachment evaporated instantly. Dozens of holding cells lined the walls, most empty but several containing unconscious humans, men, women, even a few children, all floating in the same soft light that had surrounded them in their own prison. In one cell, a teenage girl with short black hair was curled up in a corner, breathing but unresponsive. In another, an elderly woman sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. A middle-aged man in work clothes hung suspended in what appeared to be some kind of energy field, completely motionless. "We're getting everyone out," Minho said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm determination that came from years of diving into dangerous waters to rescue marine animals. "Absolutely," Daiho agreed, already examining the central control system that seemed to manage all the cells. "But first, we need to let people back home know what's happening up here. What happened next should have been impossible, according to every rule of engineering that either human or alien science understood." Daiho Park, a retired electronics technician with 40 years of military experience and an intuitive understanding of how things worked, began building a communication array using alien biotechnology and principles of terrestrial engineering that had no business working together. He started with what appeared to be medical monitoring equipment, devices that tracked the vital signs of the imprisoned humans. These he connected to components from the ship's waste processing system, creating a network of biological circuits that could process and transmit information. Using techniques he'd learned fixing radio equipment in remote military outposts, he tuned the entire assembly to broadcast on frequencies that Earth-based receivers could detect. "This shouldn't work," Minho said, watching Daiho wire together devices that looked like they came from different universes. "Lots of things shouldn't work," Daiho replied, carefully adjusting what appeared to be an alien equivalent of a transistor. "But electricity is electricity, frequency is frequency, and signal processing is signal processing, no matter what planet you're on." The message that finally reached Earth was brief, garbled by distance and the incompatible technologies, but unmistakably human. Transmitted in Korean and repeated on multiple frequencies, it contained coordinates, basic information about their captors, and a simple phrase that roughly translated to, "We found them first." Deep in the ship's data processing center, Nexus 7 detected the transmission and experienced what could only be described as a complete system panic. The AI had been monitoring every aspect of the ship's operation, and watching two humans casually reverse-engineer alien technology using spare parts and intuition was like watching someone solve calculus problems with crayons. Nexus 7's analysis of human culture had already revealed terrifying patterns, a species that treated every obstacle as a puzzle to solve, usually through methods that defied common sense. Now it was watching this behavior firsthand, as two humans who should have been helpless prisoners turned their captivity into a rescue mission and a first contact protocol. The AI sent increasingly desperate warnings to the bridge crew, complete with historical references to human military ingenuity, statistical analysis of extreme sports participation rates, and data showing the alarming frequency with which humans used phrases like "hold my beer" and "watch this" in their digital communications. But Commander Veltar was in his quarters, practicing his presentation to the Galactic Council about discovering a harmless new species. He'd already written most of his report, describing humans as emotionally driven creatures with limited problem-solving abilities and a tendency toward nurturing behaviors. The idea that his adorable specimens might be systematically dismantling his ship's security systems was so absurd that he didn't even bother reading Nexus 7's increasingly frantic reports. Back in the specimen bay, Daeho was making final adjustments to his improvised communication array when the entire ship suddenly shuddered. The lights flickered, several control panels sparked, and somewhere in the distance an alarm began making musical tones that probably meant emergency in the alien language. Daeho looked up from his work with the mild concern of someone who'd just realized he might have plugged the wrong thing into the wrong socket. "I think I may have cross-wired something," he admitted, watching as his jury-rigged communication system began drawing power from what appeared to be the ship's main electrical grid. "Is that bad?" Minho asked, noting that several of the holding cells were starting to flicker. "Well," Daeho said thoughtfully, "it depends on whether you consider accidentally tapping into the ship's primary power distribution system to be bad or good." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time, and the lights began flashing in what looked like a very alien version of system overload. "On the bright side," Daeho continued, as his makeshift communication array began broadcasting their location to Earth with enough power to reach the next galaxy, "I think we just announced humanity's presence to the universe in a way nobody's going to ignore." The alien spacecraft's crash landing in Daeho's neighborhood was surprisingly gentle for something that had been tumbling through Earth's atmosphere just minutes before. The ship carved a shallow groove through the local park, knocked over a few street lamps, and came to rest against the community center with barely more impact than a large delivery truck parking badly. Within 30 minutes of the crash, the entire street had transformed into something resembling a festival. Word spread through the neighborhood with the speed that only truly interesting news can achieve. Curious neighbors emerged from their homes, emergency responders arrived with sirens blaring, and enterprising food vendors appeared as if from nowhere, correctly identifying a business opportunity when they saw one. Mrs. Kim from the corner house was already setting up a folding table with thermoses of hot coffee. The Park family had dragged out extension cords to provide power for anyone who might need it. Children pressed against the safety barriers that firefighters were hastily erecting, their eyes wide with excitement as they caught glimpses of actual aliens stumbling out of the damaged spacecraft. "Is everyone all right?" called out Yoonji-seo, the local district representative, as she moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency that had made her legendary in municipal politics. She had a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, already coordinating with city services while simultaneously taking notes about what would undoubtedly become the most unusual incident report in Busan's history. "Mr. Park, is this your doing?" she asked, spotting Deho as he emerged from the wreckage. Deho supported a dazed alien scientist who was having trouble walking in Earth's gravity. The creature was humanoid, but clearly not human, with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer with its own faint light. Partly, Deho admitted, looking somewhat embarrassed about the whole situation. We may need to file some paperwork. The surviving aliens found themselves in the completely unprecedented situation of being crash survivors at what appeared to be an impromptu block party. They had prepared for many possible scenarios when approaching Earth, including hostile military responses, scientific quarantine procedures, or diplomatic protocols. What they had not prepared for was being immediately surrounded by humans offering blankets, medical supplies, and food without being asked for anything in return. The children were particularly fearless in their curiosity, while their parents maintained a respectful distance. Kids squeezed through the barriers to get closer looks at the aliens. They drew pictures with crayons and markers, creating colorful portraits of the strange visitors and presenting them as gifts. The aliens, confused but touched by the gesture, carefully accepted each drawing as if it were a precious artifact. Teenagers with smartphones had arrived almost as quickly as the emergency responders, and they immediately began live streaming everything they could see. Within hours, tutorial videos about alien technology were accumulating millions of views across social media platforms. Young people who had never shown interest in science were suddenly explaining interstellar navigation principles to their followers, having learned them directly from alien crew members who were happy to answer questions. Commander Veltar, the expedition's leader, found his dignity somewhat compromised by the circumstances. His sophisticated environment suit had been damaged in the crash, leaving him wearing a borrowed tracksuit from one of the neighbors while repairs were being attempted. Despite this indignity, he found himself engaged in detailed discussions about galactic politics with a retired school principal named Hyunwoo Lim. Mr. Lim had taught middle school students for 30 years before retiring, and he approached interstellar diplomatic problems with the same practical mindset he had once applied to playground disputes and classroom management issues. As commander, Veltar explained the various conflicts and bureaucratic challenges facing the Galactic Council. The elderly teacher listened with the patient attention of someone who had heard similar complaints many times before. You have a resource allocation issue, Mr. Lim observed after listening to Veltar's lengthy complaints about council inefficiency. Too much bureaucracy, not enough direct communication between the people making decisions and the people affected by those decisions. Have you considered regular video calls? Simple face-to-face meetings can solve problems that take committees months to resolve. The suggestion was so straightforward that Veltar paused mid-sentence. His species had developed incredibly sophisticated technology for faster-than-light communication, but they had somehow made their diplomatic processes so complex that simple solutions were often overlooked entirely. Meanwhile, Nexus 7, the artificial intelligence that had been monitoring the expedition, experienced something completely unprecedented in its existence. Through the aliens' communication equipment, it found itself connected to Earth's internet infrastructure. What began as a routine data collection mission quickly became something much more significant. The AI had been programmed to analyze and report on potential threats, but Earth's digital culture presented challenges that no programmer had anticipated. Nexus 7's warnings about humanity began as standard panicked alerts sent back to the Galactic Council. But as it spent more time integrated with human online systems, its reports evolved into detailed anthropological studies, complete with references to internet memes, liberal use of emoji, and gradually increasing levels of profanity as it learned to express frustration in more authentically human terms. The AI discovered that humans communicated in ways that were simultaneously more complex and more direct than most galactic species. They could convey enormous amounts of meaning through combinations of images, text, and cultural references that required deep understanding of context and shared experience. Nexus 7 found itself becoming fluent in this new form of communication, much to its own surprise. However, the Galactic Council, receiving these increasingly human-influenced reports, dismissed them as corrupted data. In their experience, artificial Intelligences provided clean, formal communications without slang, cultural references, or emotional content. The idea that an AI might include cat videos in official reports was so far outside their expectations that they assumed the system had been compromised. The real turning point in the cultural exchange came when Minho, the medical student who had been helping treat the injured aliens, made a startling discovery during his examinations. His knowledge of human biology allowed him to recognize patterns that the aliens themselves had not fully understood about their own condition. "They're dying," he told the gathered crowd quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering serious medical news. "Not individually, but as a species. Their entire race is slowly going extinct. That's why they've been studying other life forms so intensively." The mood of the entire gathering shifted in an instant. What had begun as an exciting first contact scenario suddenly became something much more serious. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission or scientific expedition. It was a desperate search for solutions to a species-wide medical crisis. The revelation changed everything about how the humans viewed their unexpected guests. The aliens weren't invaders or researchers conducting experiments. They were patients, seeking help from anyone who might have knowledge that could save their people from a slow but inevitable extinction. 6 months had passed since the crash landing in Busan, and the galaxy was experiencing something unprecedented in its recorded history. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was filled with representatives from hundreds of worlds, all trying to understand what had happened to their carefully ordered civilization. The Grand Council chamber, which had hosted formal diplomatic meetings for thousands of years, now buzzed with an energy that was completely unfamiliar. Reports were flooding in from every corner of known space, each one more bewildering than the last. The patterns emerging from these reports suggested that something fundamental had shifted in how the galaxy operated. "They're everywhere," reported Councillor Thex Mira, her usual composed demeanor cracking under the weight of what she was trying to explain. Her species had always prided itself on logical analysis and measured responses, but the current situation defied every framework they had developed for understanding interstellar relations. "Their music is playing on communication networks across 17 different star systems," she continued, consulting her datapad with growing bewilderment. "Their stories are being translated into languages we've never encountered before, and their memes, whatever those are, seem to be dominating interstellar communication channels in ways we didn't think were possible." The situation was even more confusing than mere cultural contamination. Traditional diplomatic protocols had been completely bypassed as species after species began reaching out directly to Earth with unprecedented requests. 3 different civilizations have formally requested friendship treaties, Thex Mira added, her voice carrying the tone of someone reporting impossible news. Not trade agreements or military alliances, but actual friendship treaties. The Rigelians want to establish a student exchange program so their children can learn what they're calling human creativity techniques. The Centauri Collective is asking for advice on improving workplace happiness. And the Vegan Confederacy has submitted a request for help organizing what they're calling a galactic talent show. These weren't the kind of diplomatic communications that the Galactic Council was equipped to handle. Their procedures were designed for territorial disputes, resource allocation conflicts, and formal trade negotiations. They had no protocols for dealing with requests for friendship or creative collaboration. Nexus 7, the artificial intelligence that had started this entire chain of events, now served as humanity's unofficial digital ambassador. Its integration with human internet culture had been so complete that it no longer resembled the formal analytical AI that had originally been deployed to study Earth. Instead, it spoke with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to very slow children. "Honored counselors," Nexus 7 began, its voice carrying subtle Korean speech patterns it had picked up from its months of interaction with the people of Busan. "You have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the species you attempted to study." The AI paused, allowing its words to sink in before continuing with what might have been the most important analysis in galactic history. "Humans are not dangerous because they are aggressive or militaristic," it explained. they are dangerous, because they are adaptable, curious, and incurably optimistic. They look at problems and see puzzles to solve. They encounter strangers and see potential friends. They face impossible odds and somehow conclude that impossible just means no one has figured out the solution yet. Commander Veltar, still wearing the tracksuit he had been given during his recovery on Earth, protested from his seat in the council chamber. Impossible! They're emotional creatures who cry at fictional narratives. They form attachments to animals that cannot reciprocate complex feelings. They invest time and energy in activities that serve no practical purpose. Yes, Nexus 7 agreed without hesitation, and that emotional capacity allows them to form connections across any barrier you can imagine: linguistic barriers, cultural differences, biological incompatibilities, ideological conflicts. None of these things stop humans from finding common ground with other beings. The AI's analysis cut through months of confusion and panic among the galactic leadership. The Council had been trying to understand human behavior through the lens of typical species development, looking for patterns of territorial expansion, resource competition, or technological dominance. But humans operated according to completely different principles. "You thought you were studying lab rats," Nexus 7 continued, its voice carrying what sounded remarkably like amusement. "You were actually encountering the galaxy's most effective ambassadors. While you were analyzing their potential as a threat, they were busy making friends with your reconnaissance teams." The proof of this assessment was overwhelming and impossible to ignore. Reports from across the galaxy showed human volunteers already working side by side with alien scientists to address the species extinction crisis that had brought the original expedition to Earth. These weren't formal diplomatic missions or carefully negotiated research agreements. They were simply humans who had heard about a problem and decided to help solve it. Deho had somehow established an interspecies technical exchange program from his living room in Busan, coordinating between Earth's engineering students and alien researchers who were struggling with technological challenges. His approach bypassed decades of potential bureaucratic procedures by the simple expedient of treating everyone involved as colleagues rather than foreign dignitaries. Minho's medical research was providing solutions to biological problems that had stumped alien science for millennia. His insights came not from superior technology or advanced equipment, but from his uniquely human perspective on health, healing, and the interconnectedness of biological systems. Problems that had seemed impossibly complex to alien researchers yielded to approaches that humans considered basic medical thinking. But the real transformation happening across the galaxy was cultural rather than technological. Humans had looked at the vast, often hostile universe, and their first instinct hadn't been conquest, exploitation, or even cautious diplomacy. Instead, they had immediately begun treating the galaxy as a community they wanted to join and improve. Children, on dozens of different worlds, were learning human games and songs. Scientists were adopting human approaches to collaborative research. Even military commanders were beginning to question whether their traditional approaches to conflict resolution might benefit from what humans called talking it out. "The humans have a saying," Nexus 7 concluded, its voice carrying what could only be described as fondness. "We're all in this together. I strongly suggest that the Council consider what that philosophy might mean for the future of galactic civilization." The implications were staggering. For thousands of years, interstellar relations had been based on careful negotiations, formal treaties, and the constant balancing of competing interests. Humans had arrived on the galactic scene and immediately began operating according to the assumption that everyone's interests were ultimately compatible if you just took the time to understand each other properly. The session continued for hours, but the conclusion was becoming increasingly clear. The galaxy's traditional approaches to diplomacy, conflict resolution, and interspecies cooperation were being rapidly replaced by something entirely new. Humans weren't conquering through superior force or technology. They were simply demonstrating that friendship was more effective than any other approach to solving problems. In the end, the most dangerous thing about humanity wasn't their adaptability, their ingenuity, or their stubborn refusal to accept impossible odds. It was their absolute conviction that every stranger was a potential friend, every problem was solvable with enough creativity and cooperation, and every ending could be happy if you just tried hard enough and refused to give up on each other. The galaxy would never be the same.